Tara stopped by the showcase, and when she saw the chocolate roll that her children loved so much, she wanted to take it, but then she stopped herself from taking it. The roll was rather expensive, and the woman decided it would be better to buy flour and make cakes. She put a bag of flour in the basket and went to the cash register to pay for her modest purchases. When the cashier was scanning the goods, Tara noticed an unfamiliar elderly man standing nearby and counting coins. She had never seen him here, and the woman became curious as to who he was and what he was doing here. When the saleswoman announced the amount of money, Tara hurried to pay quickly so as not to delay the other customers. She stepped away from the counter and began to put the change into her purse. But suddenly she heard the saleswoman reprimanding the elderly man. "Do I look like a millionaire, paying for everybody here? And who are you to believe you? I'll give it back," muttered the elderly man uncertainly. As Tara realized, the man was only about 20 cents short to buy bread. The woman felt very sorry for him. He did not look like a con man who had come to cheat on purpose. So without thinking twice, she handed the money to the saleswoman. She could not help the needy man, especially since he was lacking very little. Maybe he had come to visit someone and the owners were not at home, or maybe he was just a homeless man who accidentally wandered into their village. Nevertheless, she did not want to leave him without food. The man thanked Tara and shamefully lowered his head and walked away from the store. She became curious, so she followed him. This house was in bad condition. The owners had long ago left it, and over the years the local outcasts had smashed all the windows and burned the furniture there. Of course, Tara lived poorly in a modest house with 4 children, but she could not leave the miserable elderly man in such conditions. So she called him to her place. He felt uncomfortable and tried to refuse, but Tara insisted. Once at her house, the elderly man understood that the woman sheltered him out of kindness, of the goodness of her heart. The conditions, of course, were much better than in the abandoned house, but it was obvious that they were living modestly. Tara looked a little over 35 years old. Her husband had recently died, and she was left with 2 sons, 12 and 5 years old, and 2 daughters, 10 and 7 years old. The woman showed the old man his room with only a bed and a chair and began to cook dinner. A little later, the woman invited her guests to the table where there were already fragrant potatoes with a salad made of vegetables from their own garden. After a hot meal, which the elderly man greedily ate, he told Tara his sad story. His name was Mr. Clark, and he had been left on the street because of his own son. They lived together, and as with many in their family, there were quarrels, but nevertheless, they got along somehow. The son was in his 50s, he was not married, and recently he brought a woman into their house. This woman was clearly annoyed by the elderly man's presence in the house, and she gradually turned Mr. Clark's son against him. He had not been pleased about his elderly father's presence before. He was waiting for him to die and leave his inheritance, but now he had become bold. Mr. Clark turned to the police, but they refused to interfere in family issues, and the elderly man did not know what to do. His papers were left in his apartment, and no nursing home would accept him without them. Though he had a daughter, she lived abroad and was very busy with her business. They were rarely in touch and only through the internet, and Mr. Clark didn't know how to use it without his son's help. So Mr. Clark decided to go to a village and settle in an abandoned house. He planned to eat whatever he could find in the woods or grow in the garden. Tara shook her head and thought that Mr. Clark could hardly have survived in such conditions, and how good it was that she had not left him alone. But not everyone was so good-natured. There were those who did not like her actions. Many villagers criticized Tara and openly laughed at her. They did not understand how she, living so poorly, could shelter a homeless man, but they could not understand the nobility of a woman who literally saved a man from certain death. Because they thought only about themselves and their welfare, Tara paid no attention to mockery, worked as best she could, and did not consider the elderly man a burden on her at all. She saw how hard it was for Mr. Clark to be without his family, and she tried not only to support him, but also to find his daughter. Tara found a woman in social networks with the same name as Mr. Clark's daughter and immediately contacted her. She did not get much hope of an answer because, according to the date of her last visit, she had not been online for over a month. Maybe it was not her at all, but so far there were no other options. Meanwhile, Mr. Clark tried not to sit idly by, but to help the hospitable family that sheltered him. He helped with household chores, worked with the children in the garden, and helped with their homework, taught them to appreciate nature, and often walked with them in the woods. He told many interesting things about plants, mushrooms, and national signs, and the children liked it very much. Though Tara asked the elderly man not to exert himself too much, she was glad because she would never tell her children so much. As time went on, the winter ended, and in the spring, with the arrival of warmth, Mr. Clark suddenly fell ill. His temperature rose, and a terrible cough began, which grew worse every day, and Tara had to call an ambulance. The paramedics immediately offered to take the man to the hospital, but without a passport and insurance, there was only a paid hospitalization possible. When Tara heard the necessary amount, she was nearly speechless. But there was no other way out. The elderly man was very bad. Tara decided to give all of her savings, which she had been saving for an emergency. She took out a box, counted the bills, and thought with despair that it would not be enough. For only 5 days, maybe, but in addition, she would need to buy medicine. And what if he needed some kind of surgery? The woman was ready to burst into tears from her own helplessness. Meanwhile, neighbors had already gathered outside and were discussing the arrival of the ambulance. Suddenly, an expensive SUV pulled up next to Tara's. Next to Tara's house, a well-groomed woman got out of it. Neighborhood gossips opened their mouths in amazement, not understanding why this poor Tara had suddenly received such attention. The woman who arrived turned out to be Mr. Clark's daughter. It should be said that she'd appeared just in time. She quickly solved the problem, and her father was immediately taken to the hospital. Tara also wanted to go, but she did not dare to leave the children at home alone. Moreover, the younger one felt a little sick. Mr. Clark's daughter thanked Tara for her concern and care for her father and assured her that she would cope with everything herself. But 2 days later, she returned to the village and said that Mr. Clark had died during the night. Tara blamed herself for not immediately noticing the deterioration of the elderly man and calling a doctor late. She begged for forgiveness of Mr. Clark's daughter, but she calmed her down and said that her father had a serious illness and that it was just luck that he had lived so long. The daughter, on the contrary, heartily thanked Tara for not being indifferent, not leaving her father in trouble, and finding her in social networks. If she had anyone to blame, it was herself. Maybe, if she had paid more attention to her father, if she had been here with him, she would have known about his illness long ago and would have put him in a better hospital. And then, he could have been saved. She blamed herself for immersing herself too much in her business and relying on her good-for-nothing brother, thinking her father was in good hands. And her brother, as it turned out, had been jealous of his sister all her life, because she was so successful, always with money, though it was not given to her for no reason. She had worked hard since she was young, and all her brother did was complain about life and do nothing. But she never expected that he would do that to their father. If he had told her everything, she would have thought of something for sure. But now it was too late. Mr. Clark's daughter thanked Tara once more and putting her hand on her shoulder said, "My father's apartment is yours now." Tara, it was my father's last will. Mr. Clark decided to thank his savior by signing a deed of gift for the apartment. His daughter invited a notary to the hospital to formalize everything as it should be. Soon, the son had to quickly pack his belongings and leave the apartment, but Tara did not feel sorry for him. He had done bad things to his father. His daughter had no claims to the apartment, and she could not refuse such a generous gift, especially since it was the dying man's last will. Mr. Clark's daughter, together with Tara, organized the funeral. The son, of course, did not show up, but many people came to see the elderly man off. Tara was greatly surprised by this. It seemed strange to her that Mr. Clark had so many acquaintances, but none of them offered help when he was in such need. After all, according to Mr. Clark's story, his son kicked him out with a scandal, and many people saw it, but no one interceded, hoping that someone else would solve the problem. Fortunately, not all people were so callous, and Mr. Clark spent the last days of his life surrounded by kind and sympathetic people. After the funeral, Mr. Clark's daughter went away and Tara started to care for his grave. She often visited him in the cemetery, and every time she thought that he was not a coincidental person in her life.